Good morning. Good to see all of you here in our Hondo this morning, and those of you who are joining us via Zoom. Good to have you with us. We'll begin this morning's service with the reading of Sambujo, followed by Juseige. Juseige, as you know, is a Gatha that is found in the larger Pure Land Sutra. It is the Bodhisattva Dharmakara before his teacher, the Buddha Lokeshvara Raja, reaffirming his intent to make possible a means through which all beings might be able to attain enlightenment. This is again the Bodhisattva Dharmakara as he begins his long practice to become Amida Buddha, fulfilling his aspiration, his intent, his vows to provide for the enlightenment of all beings. Having fulfilled that, he becomes the Buddha Amida. So as we read this Juseige, it is the words of the Bodhisattva Dharmakara before his teacher, the Buddha Lokeshvara Raja. If you will now join, please, in the reading of Sambujo, followed by Juseige. If you please rise and join in the reading of the three treasures on page 8 in the large service book. Hard is it to be born into human life. Now we are living it. Difficult is it to hear the teachings of the Blessed One. Now we hear it. If we do not realize the truth in this life, when will it be realized? Let us reverently take refuge in the three treasures of the truth. I take refuge in the Buddha. May we absorb ourselves in the principle of the way to enlightenment and awaken in ourselves the supreme will. I take refuge in the Dharma. May we be submerged in the depths of the doctrine and gain wisdom as deep as the ocean. I take refuge in the Sangha. May we live in harmony in the great assembly as disciples of Buddha and be freed from all hindrances, becoming units of true accord in the life of harmony, in a spirit of universal oneness, freed from the bondage of selfishness. Even through myriad ages of kalpas, hard is it to hear such an excellent, profound, and wonderful doctrine. Now we are able to hear and receive it. Let us thoroughly understand the true meaning of Tathagata's teaching. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you. Please be seated. I'd like to begin with a reading from the Kyogyo Shinsho. This is the collected works of Shinran. So over several decades, the writings of Shinran were translated, and about maybe, this was published maybe in the 80s, but the entire collection was put together and published in this collected works of Shinran. Although this book, you can still find it in some places, but there's actually an online version of this that has been printed. So if you look for collected works of Shinran, you'll be able to find it if you kind of look around on the internet. Everything's available on the internet. Okay, so this is from the preface of the Kyogyo Shinsho. I reflect within myself. The universal vow, difficult to fathom, is indeed a great vessel bearing us across the ocean difficult to cross. The unhindered light is the sun of wisdom, dispersing the darkness of our ignorance. Thus it is that when conditions for teaching of birth in the Pure Land had matured, Devadatta provoked Ajatasattu to commit grave crimes. And when the opportunity arose for explaining the pure act by which birth is settled, Shakyamuni led Vaidehi to select the land of peace. In their selfless love, these incarnated ones, Devadatta, Ajatasattu, Vaidehi, all aspired to save the multitudes of beings from pain and affliction. And in his great compassion, Shakyamuni, the great hero, sought indeed to bless those committing the 5 grave offenses, those slandering the Dharma, and those lacking the seed of Buddhahood. We know, therefore, that the auspicious name embodying the perfect fullness, fulfilled supreme virtues is truism, that transforms our evil into virtue, and that the diamond-like Shinjin, so difficult to accept, is true reality that sweeps away doubt and brings us to the attainment of enlightenment. Namanda, namandams, namanda, namandams, namandams. this is from, again, the preface of the Kyogyo Shinsho, Shinnan's major work. It is in this Kyogyo Shinsho that Shinnan describes the pieces of his understanding of the Buddha Dharma. Traditionally, before Shinnan, there were what was called the three pillars of Buddhism. Kyo, which is teachings, Gyo, which is practice, and Sho. So Kyo, Gyo, Sho. Sho is attainment. So you studied and learned the teachings, and then you practice what you learned, and through practicing, you're able to reach attainment, to Sho, reach enlightenment. And this is the way in which Buddhism had been practiced and taught for centuries. And Shinran recognized his inability to attain the second of these three pillars. So Kyo was the teachings. He could read the teachings, study the teachings, practice the teachings. But the second, Gyo, practice, he realized how difficult it was for him to fulfill what was required in the practices. And if you couldn't fulfill the practices, then there's no opportunity to reach attainment, Sho. But as he continued to study and learn from teachers, and after he left Hiezan, where he studied for some 20 years, he eventually left Hiezan and he found a teacher, Honen. And through Honen, he began to recognize how profound this inability to cultivate enlightenment was, but that at the same time, unable to cultivate enlightenment, he was still assured of that same enlightenment through the work of Amida Buddha. And we read the Juseige that Dharmakara, the Bodhisattva Dharmakara, expresses before his teacher his intent to provide a means to which everyone, regardless of abilities or skills, that everyone would be able to attain enlightenment. And having fulfilled this vow, Dharmakara becomes the Buddha Amida. And so although Shinran recognized his inability to fulfill the practice and to attain enlightenment, he also realized that beings such as himself, unable to cultivate the mind of enlightenment, were still assured there was a means through which that he too could attain release from samsara, that he too could attain enlightenment. And so the Kyogyo Shinsho, this major work, introduces into these three pillars of Buddhism, introduces this Shin no Maki, this chapter on Shin, the trust that I too will be able to attain enlightenment, the trust that in trusting in Amida's vow, I too am transformed and able to realize enlightenment. So Shinran's Kyogyo Shinsho is still a part of the teachings of the Buddha, in that it expresses what the teachings are, what the practice is. And in this case, the practice is not my practice, but rather the practice of Amida Buddha that affirms all of us as we are of the eventual, and that's the assurance of the eventual realization of enlightenment, the Sho. So Kyo, the teachings, Kyo, Gyo, the practice of Amida Buddha, and in this case, the third chapter, Shin, the relationship between Amida Buddha and myself, and Sho, attainment. So that's the structure of the Shoshinge. And in this preface of the Shoshinge, Shinran talks about an event that occurs in the time of Shakyamuni Buddha. This is the tragedy of Rajagriha. I add tragedy because it's there. I don't know. They just call it something about Rajagriha. I forget what it's called. But in this episode or event that takes place in Rajagriha. And there are references outside the teachings of the Buddha of this place of Rajagriha, the king Bimbasara, his wife Vaidehi, and their son Ajatasattu. So historically, when we look at the pillars of Ashoka, Ashoka was a Mauryan king. Eventually, I guess we called him. He was a king of a very large. Most of Asia came under his rule. But one of the things that Ashoka did was to erect these pillars that describe the teachings of the Buddha. In his early life, Ashoka simply, was out to consolidate as many of the regions of Asia as he could, and so he was ruthless in his domination of Asia. But following a particular battle, where 100,000 people lay dead, Ashoka changed his mind, and he realized how much harm he had been causing in his aspiration to become this ruler of an empire. And he turned to Buddhism. And when he turned to Buddhism, he began to erect these pillars throughout this Mauryan empire. And on these obelisks, on these pillars that Ashoka erected, can be found in some places this story or this reference to Rajagriha, Bimbasara, Ajatasattu, and Vaidehi. So outside of Buddhism itself, Buddhism proper, outside of the sutras of Buddhism, there are references to Bimbasara, Vaidehi, and Ajatasattu. And in this story, Devadatta, who is a disciple, a student, a cousin also of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, Devadatta he wants to become a great teacher, and he's often kind of giving Siddhartha a hard time, and so he's always trying to gain more students, always trying to establish his authority and his stature through the kind of accumulation of members. And he convinces Ajatasattu that before he was born, his parents learned that they would have a son, but that this son's birth was dependent upon the ending of a life of a hermit that lived nearby. And this recluse would eventually die, and when he died, their son would be born. And when Vaidehi and Bimbasara learned of this, they decided that they didn't want to wait, and so they had that ascetic killed. And then their son, Ajatasattu, was born. And when Vaidehi and Bimbasara realized what they had done, they decided that they would take the life of their infant child. And so they threw Ajatasattu off a cliff. And spears were at the bottom of the cliff, pointing upwards, and they threw Ajatasattu off this cliff into this kind of field of spears. But somehow, miraculously, Ajatasattu survived. With the only injury to Ajatasattu was a nick on his finger. And this is the nick, or this is the scar that Devadatta pointed to and said, this is proof that this is what your parents did to you. Now, I don't know how gullible Ajatasattu was, but obviously he believed this story. Now Devadatta had, he had the intent of trying to get more, and he wanted, if he could receive the support of this prince, right, Ajatasattu, the son of Vaidehi and Bimbisara, if he could receive that support from Ajatasattu, his stature would grow, and more people, more disciples would come and gather to Ajatasattu. So Devadatta would gather to Devadatta if he had the support of Ajatasattu. So Devadatta was thinking, if I get his support, right, that my stature will grow. And Ajatasattu, on his part, trusted in Devadatta and believed what Devadatta said. So, out of anger, Ajatasattu imprisoned his father with the intent of starving him to death. Vaidehi couldn't, of course, sit back and allow this to happen. And so Vaidehi began smuggling food into Bimbisara. And no matter how long Ajatasattu waited, his father didn't die. And he wondered why was his father continuing to live when they provided no food for him, no water, and yet he continued to live. And then he found out that his mother had been smuggling food into the cell of Bimbisara. And in anger, he was going to kill his mother, but his advisors stopped him from doing that, with saying that in all of the history of Rajagriha, never has a son risen to power to the killing of his mother. And so he stopped short of killing of Vaidehi, but imprisoned Vaidehi as well. In this state, her son have gone mad, her husband dying in a cell. Vaidehi called out to Shakyamuni Buddha, and Shakyamuni Buddha appeared and described to her a means through which she too could find release from the difficulties that she was experiencing. And so that's the story of that Rajagriha. What drew me to this, to talk about this today, was in this preface of the Kyogyo Shinsho, Shinran mentions Devadatta, Ajatasattu, and Vaidehi. He doesn't mention Bimbisara, and that kind of struck me. And it's only recently that I kind of started thinking about why didn't Shinran mention Bimbisara? Was it simply an oversight? But I don't think so. It couldn't have been an oversight because he probably rewrote this many times. And this is the preface, so this kind of starts everything, right? And he describes Devadatta, Ajatasattu, and Vaidehi. In their selfless love, these incarnated ones, Devadatta, Ajatasattu, Vaidehi, all aspire to save the multitudes of beings from pain and affliction. So, these three individuals are almost kind of actors in history, actors who help us to think about what Shakyamuni Buddha, under these very kind of dire circumstances, helps us to hear what Vaidehi heard when she was imprisoned. But I kind of wonder, how come Shinran didn't mention, because they're all important. Well, at least in my understanding, they're all important. We could say that, well, Devadatta is important because he conspired and he convinced Ajatasattu, who eventually imprisoned his mother and his father. So these are two important characters. And Devadatta goes on to cause other kinds of problems for Shakyamuni Buddha. This isn't the only instance in which Devadatta is being a bother for Shakyamuni Buddha. And then Vaidehi, we can kind of understand that she calls to Shakyamuni Buddha, who appears and then begins to talk about Pure Land. So these three characters, yeah. But Bimbisara eventually he dies. And in the historical records of Rajagriha, Ajatasattu does indeed kill Bimbisara, starves Bimbisara to death. And you would think, or I would think, that Bimbisara played an important role in this episode at Rajagriha. But I guess when we really consider what Shinran was trying to convey to us, that the death of Bimbisara that may have initiated this was the first step in Ajatasattu's effort to gain power, to gain the throne of Rajagriha, that he may not have been as important a character. But still, I think, he played a part. Was he not an incarnated one? Maybe not so important in this story that sets this scene for Vaidehi to call Shakyamuni Buddha, and for Shakyamuni Buddha to appear. This story of Rajagriha, these individuals were important enough for Shinran that he included this in the first paragraph, literally, in this Kyogyo Shinsho. He continues and he writes, I have to hold this up, otherwise my arms are not long enough. We know, therefore, that the auspicious name, embodying the perfectly fulfilled supreme virtues, is true wisdom and transforms our evil into virtue, and that the diamond-like Shinjin, so difficult to accept, is true reality that sweeps away doubt and brings us to the attainment of enlightenment. This, then, is a true teaching, easy to practice for small, foolish beings. It is a straight way, easy to traverse for the dull and the ignorant. Among all the teachings the great sage preached in his lifetime, none surpasses this ocean of virtues. Let the one who seeks to abandon the defiled and aspire for the pure, who are confused in practice and vacillating in faith, whose mind is dark and whose understanding deficient, whose evils are heavy and whose karmic obstructions manifold, let such persons embrace above all the Tathagata's exhortations that take refuge without fail in the most excellent direct path, devote themselves solely to this practice, and revere only this Shinjin. Hard to encounter even in many lifetimes is the decisive cause of birth. Amida's universal vow, hard to realize even in myriads of kalpas, is pure Shinjin that is true and real. If you should come to realize this practice and Shinjin, rejoice at the conditions that from the distant past that have brought it about. So it's an important kind of episode that for Shinran, important enough that he includes it in this preface. What Shinran, Vaidehi's call to Shakyamuni Buddha from her state of being imprisoned by her son, Shakyamuni Buddha appears and begins to talk about how to envision the Pure Land. And he begins by describing, first to envision, I think it's the water, and then the horizon, and then the sun, and then eventually taking Vaidehi to being able to envision the Pure Land. And in that Pure Land, Amida Buddha. That Amida Buddha that we, whose verse or whose Gatha before his teacher Lokeshwara Rasha that we read about in the Juseige. For Shinran, this was the path, this was the means to which he too could realize enlightenment, that he too could realize the resolution of difficulties that we cause and experience. That even though he could not attain enlightenment or fulfill the practices that would lead to enlightenment, through this assurance of Amida Buddha, Shinran was able to recognize that he too was able to be freed of difficulties. This is the Shinjin that is spoken about. This is the Shinjin that chapter that Shinran kind of includes among these three pillars. That this Shinjin, the assurance of Amida Buddha, that provides for the enlightenment of all beings, is a means through which we too, although we may or may not be capable of cultivating the mind of enlightenment, that I too am able to resolve the difficulties that I cause and experience. And we simply respond and we say, Namo Amida Butsu, in gratitude for that assurance. This preface of the Kyogyo Shinsho begins this point from which Shinran's understanding and appreciation of the Buddha Dharma that includes him as well, that does not leave those who are not capable of cultivating, of fulfilling the practices, of cultivating the mind of enlightenment, that we too are able to eventually realize enlightenment ourselves. Okay, so if you get a chance, this isn't all Kyogyo Shinshu, there's other stuff in here too. But Shinran wrote a lot of poems, a lot of verses that we read at different times. And they're all in that, I think that it's, if you look up collected works of Shinran, is that what it is? On the internet, collected works of Shinran. You'll find these writings on the internet. And very nicely done. I think he has been working on this for many years, and now it's kind of nicely put together. All of Shinran's writings on that website. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning. Let's conclude with a Gatha. What shall we sing? Nothing hard. Well, I think the one that maybe we might know well is Namo Amida Butsu on page 174. How come Ondokusan is not in here? Or maybe it's in the back, that's why. Ondokusan must be in here somewhere, huh? Two? Okay, yeah, let's sing Ondokusan. Ondokusan II on page 220. If you please rise. Okay, ready? Yorai dai no ondokuhan miyoko ni shite mo hozu beshi shishu chishiki no ondoku mo hone o kudakite mo shasu beshi. Gassho, please. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda. Thank you. Please be seated. Thank you for joining us this morning. We'll continue with our regular kind of Sunday morning services next week. If you have an opportunity, please join us again. Are there any announcements, anything that we need to? Are we all okay? Well, there are a lot of you that came in while the service was ongoing. Welcome. Yeah, again, thank you for joining us this morning. If you'd like to please come forward for a shoko. I will see you next time. Thanks for bento yesterday. You do it twice a day as a tradition. Super. Thank you.
sometimes, even regular days, I know some people, oh, it's nice, I just, we want to see inside, I know. Well, lots of people have a curiosity about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good, I'm gonna get that.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want these to be put away? Since you have a funeral home.